So much for everybody who has come in as of this time to be with us with this work on this workshop. I am Raquel Sartaguda. I'm the manager of rental programs with Home San Francisco, and today we're bringing you a workshop on knowing your rights. This is specific to San Francisco tenants, and it's being brought to us by Daniel Wayne, coming from the San Francisco Tenants Union. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping rules that we want to go over. For today, this particular workshop is currently being recorded. The purpose of this one is for you as viewers today. You could come back and gain access to it if you do want to review certain things. And of course, for future people who may want to review information regarding tenants' rights. So we want to make this information accessible to the general public, and that way they have this information, these valuable information. So as such, I want to invite everybody to please remain muted throughout the presentation. And then we will, don't worry, we will be entertaining questions towards the end of the presentation. So go ahead and gather all of your questions and put that in our chat. And then we'll answer that together for you later on towards the end. Okay? Now that being said, if you do have any issues with the sound or the video at any point during this workshop, you could either one, help let us know by emailing, by messaging me directly. I'm the tech person for this one. Either I or Daniel will be able to, but more so me because I'm tech support as well for this particular workshop. Or better yet, email us at info@homesanfrancisco.org. So far, though, I was wondering, are all of you hearing us and seeing our screen? At this point, you should be, oh, great. Thank you so much for the nods and the thumbs up. So for this particular workshop, we should be on the housekeeping screen. So anyway, before we go ahead also with the presentation, for those who want to be able to follow along through closed captioning, I do want to provide some instructions as to how you could do that. If you are currently on your computer, you could go to the control panel, which is at the bottom, most oftentimes, or at the top. For those, I'm assuming most of you may know, but then again, in case, we're going to go through this together as if we're all learning at the same time. So for the computer, you could go basically click at the bottom where you see CC, the icon CC, or see the ellipses or the three dots at the bottom, and look for show caption. From there, there should be a list that will show up, and then pick the language basically for this particular one. If it's English, you could go ahead and pick that. And so that's for the computer side of things. Now, if you are on the phone or a tablet, it's a little bit different. It's gonna be basically it's gonna say captions. So if you are on the phone right now, you may need to scroll through the screens. But I'm seeing that most likely you might be on the computer or at this point, but you just have to scroll through the screens until you see the control panel and see captions, and then it should pop up a pop-up screen. And then if you see the line that says captions, and then you see there's a button. If it's on the left side, that's deactivated or off. And if it's on the right side, the circle, that should be activated. And so you click on that until it's green, and then you pick the language of your choice. Pretty easy, right? And I think some of you have already used this one before. So would that be good? Are we good to proceed then? Thank you so much for allowing me to show that. So we'll go ahead then and go to first explaining who we are and what we do. By show of hands, are any of you familiar who Home San Francisco is? No? Well, you know what? Okay, good. Daniel knows who we are. Well, you know what? If you don't know who we are, Home San Francisco used to be Home Ownership San Francisco. I don't know if that still rings a bell. So what we are a resource hub and a coalition. What we do is provide education, information, referrals, and resources to renters, homeowners, homebuyers, people seeking financial advice or financial information, also even community organizations itself or themselves. We also are a resource hub. So what we do, we try to connect each other to the services, information, resources that pertains to housing needs or financial questions. So that's who we are. Now, if you notice though, there are five different agencies that are on our page right now. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but there's Asian Inc., Balance, the Mission Economic Development Agency, the San Francisco LGBT Center, and the San Francisco Housing Development Corporation. These are actually our five founding members and also currently member organizations that are HUD certified. They provide education, resources, and counseling for homebuyers, renters, homeowners, and people seeking financial counseling services or information. So, anyway, with that being said, I want to hand this over now to Daniel Wayne. He will be presenting on this topic. He's our expert, and he's coming from the San Francisco Tenants Union. So, anyway, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Raquel. Thanks to Home SF for putting this on and for asking me to come and chat with y'all. And thanks to all of you for coming today. I'm a tenants' rights lawyer. I'm a partner at a law firm called Wolford Wayne here in town, and have been practicing in the area of landlord-tenant law on behalf of tenants for almost 15 years. And I am a volunteer with San Francisco Tenants Union. If you're not familiar with the San Francisco Tenants Union, it's an incredible resource for tenants located here in the Mission District in San Francisco. It is on Cap Street and offers counseling, drop-in counseling for tenants if you ever have questions. It's available on a first come first serve basis in terms of the counseling, but you want to check the website to make sure you come on a day where there's a counseling session scheduled, so that you can ensure that you can talk to somebody. So it's a great resource. It's fully volunteer ran for the most part. I think we have maybe one new employee, but for a while we had no employees there. And my business partner and I have been, like I said, both volunteering there a long time. So today we are going to talk about tenants' rights. I imagine that you are all tenants, but if you are not, hopefully this is still useful information for you. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And if we want to keep going to the next one, to evictions. So first question for folks, it's kind of a rhetorical question, which is, why do people lose their homes in San Francisco? Why do tenants lose their homes? Anybody want to weigh in with the number one reason? Well, the number one reason is that people don't know their rights. So if you don't know your rights, you are more likely to get evicted through a wrongful eviction. That is where a landlord essentially tricks a tenant into moving out, insists that they have to move out when in fact a tenant doesn't have to move out. Tenants might be evicted or lose their homes in some non-legal manner through any number of other means as well. Raquel, there's like a little black box that's showing up on the screen. I don't know what's going on there. It was happening earlier too, so just as a heads up. So we're going to talk through getting to know your rights as a tenant today, and hopefully answer questions you have as well. So going to the next slide, there's a few things you should be aware of as a tenant. First of all, one really critical thing that comes up a lot is what and when what the rules are for when a landlord can enter your home. Okay, your landlord cannot simply show up at your front door and walk in the door and say, hey, I'm here to come check out your place, right? There are only certain reasons the landlord can enter a tenant's home, and they have to do it in a certain manner. What do they have to do? Well, they have to provide you with a written 24-hour notice that is posted on your door. Not sent by email, not a text message. They have to give you a formal written notice that identifies the reason why the landlord needs to come into your unit. And that reason has to be one of the reasons enumerated under the law. It's California Civil Code 1954. You don't need to know that, but there are specific reasons you can come in, and they include things like if your landlord is selling the property and they want to show it to a prospective buyer in order to make necessary or agreed on repairs, or to get an appraisal for purposes of sale, for example. Okay. It's not because, hey, I want to snoop around and see if you live here, or, see what you're doing with the property. Your landlord also has to provide you with a habitable premises. That's a really key thing. What is a habitable premises? We're going to talk more about that as we go along. But it means they have to provide you with a place that's safe and reasonable to live in. It means making repairs in a timely manner. It means providing you with a place that is up to code, as opposed to a place that they built off the side of their house with, a hammer and nails, right? And finally, they have to provide you with a copy of your lease if you request it in writing. Ideally, you keep a copy of your lease. Sometimes tenants lose the track of their leases, but if you don't have a copy of it, you can ask your landlord for it, and hopefully they have a copy themselves, and we'll give it to you. All right. Additionally, your landlord cannot lock you out of your home, right? There are rules for when and how a landlord can evict a tenant from their home, which we're going to go through. A landlord cannot simply say, hey, I changed the locks, your stuff's on the front yard, have a nice life. If that ever happens to you or somebody you know, talk to a tenant lawyer. You probably have a good case. Landlords cannot evict a tenant or raise the rent without written notice, and there are very specific rules for that as well, in terms of how much the rent can be raised and what the basis for an eviction is. They can't charge you punitive late fees. What's punitive late fee? Well, if it's $50, it's probably fine. $200, not fine. They can't require you to pay your rent by cash or online. If you are paying your rent in cash, make sure you're getting a receipt. But you are not obligated to pay by cash, and you are not obligated to follow a certain protocol that they dictate. Yeah, next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about rent control. There's kind of two components specifically talking about San Francisco. We have what's called a rent ordinance, right? We have a local law that is specific to San Francisco that's been around for many years at this point. And it basically has two primary components. The first is rent control. And the second, which we're going to get to, is eviction control. So with regard to rent control, what is rent control? Well, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically sets rules on the amount a landlord can raise a tenant's rent. Does it mean that they can't raise your rent at all, ever? No, it does not. But rent increases are capped and managed by the San Francisco Rent Board. So the San Francisco Rent Board is a governing body. It's an administrative body that is tasked with essentially doling out the rules on this stuff, and they do a number of different things. They have hearings. There's a bunch of different housing related resources that they provide in conjunction with the courts, which actually have to make determinations when disputes arise. Okay, so they're like a government entity. With regard to rent increases, each year the rent board puts out the rent increase allowable amount, and it's typically it is capped based on consumer price index for the Bay Area. So it's actually set to 60% of the Bay Area consumer price index for the time period beforehand, to basically ensure that landlords on some level are able to raise rents in conjunction with inflation, but not based on market demand. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if I move into a place tomorrow and I'm paying $3,000 a month in rent, it means that that's going to be my rent for as long as I'm living there. That's going to be the amount that's pegged at. It can be raised each year based on interest rate, based on the inflation rate. The landlord has to give me a notice for that to be in effect. The landlord also has to register the property with the city for that to be in effect. And there are a couple of other ways landlords can increase rent, but they're very limited. And they're things like operation and maintenance pass-throughs and capital improvement pass-throughs. And there are specific rules on that, which I don't think we're getting into today. And you don't really frankly need to deal with until you get one. But there are limited rent increases for those as well. It's not like a landlord can just raise your rent arbitrarily because they want to install a sauna or something downstairs, which they're never going to do anyways, right? Okay. The other thing to be aware of is that there's no such thing as an eviction without just cause, at least legally. A landlord can only evict a tenant if they have just cause. Are you covered as a tenant of the rent ordinance? Well, not everybody in the city is, although most tenants are. There's a few exceptions to where rent control applies. They include things like properties built after 1979. The rent ordinance specifically provides rent control for tenants built or units built before 1979. It also excludes rent control is also also excluded from rent control are condominiums and single family homes. How do you know if you live in a condo versus an apartment? That's a question that I get asked a lot. Well, a condo is defined as it's owned by a different owner than maybe the neighbor's unit is owned by, right? So each unit is owned separately by a different owner. And you can actually go on the property information map website, and I can provide that link if people need it. But you can look up who the owner is. You can see what kind of property you live in, etc. And it'll give you mostly accurate data. I can't promise it's always up to date. I don't know how the city handles that, but I find it to be a useful tool. But most likely you have rent control. If you're in an apartment building, it's an older building, the chances are it's a rent control building. Single family homes and condos are exempt, as I mentioned, as are government owned or subsidized properties. So Section 8 is not part of rent control. It's part of eviction control, but not part of rent control. Specifically, there's a couple different types of Section 8 housing. There's voucher based, which is where you basically rent from any landlord. They agree to accept your voucher. And so the rent is being paid in part by you and in part by Section 8. And the other type of Section 8 is what's called project based. And that's where HUD in conjunction with a nonprofit runs the entire property. So it's not a private landlord. And they're exempt from rent control. Single family homes with an in-law unit, those are covered, right? So this is something that we see a lot in the avenues. So if you live in the Richmond district or the Sunset, for example, there's a ton of single family homes with an in-law unit. Most of those in-law units were built back in the day without permits, and that means that they are illegal. So in order to be a legal unit, it has to have what's called a separate certificate of occupancy. And again, most in-law units, you can kind of tell this is probably not a legal unit. Maybe it's a little bit of a lower ceiling, or maybe there's only one exit, or you're entering through the garage. It's identified as an A or a 1.5 or something like that. There's things like that that can be tells. Sometimes in-law units are totally fine and safe, even if they are illegal. But there are even if that in-law unit was built after 1979, if it was built without permits, it's still covered by rent control, as is the other unit in the building. So that's something that's a unique wrinkle. If you want to increase rent as a landlord, you got to get a license. That's a new thing as of a couple years ago. How do you get a license? Well, landlords have to basically register with the city, with the housing inventory. They have to register the housing inventory and basically say, hey, I'm a landlord, I'm renting this out. And then the city grants them a license to do it. You can check to see if your landlord has a license online, housing inventory online portal. If you just Google that, you should be able to find it pretty easily. If you find out that your landlord hasn't registered, that is an argument for why you are not obligated to pay a rent increase, because they cannot impose a rent increase if they have not registered with the city and they have an active license. If you wanted to figure out whether or not a rent increase was valid or not, you could file a petition, for example, with the rent board. It's called the tenant summary petition to determine if a rent increase is valid. In addition to the local rent ordinance that we have in San Francisco, some properties are also protected for tenants in terms of rent and eviction control under state law. 2019, the state of California passed a bill called the California Tenant Protection Act that provides expanded protections to some tenants that maybe otherwise wouldn't have had protection. For people in San Francisco, candidly, it doesn't really change a lot because we have our local ordinance is stronger than the state law. Where it is helpful is basically like as we talked about before, if a building is built before 1979, then it's under rent control, and if it's built after 1979, it's not. To make things kind of confusing, under the California Tenant Protection Act, buildings that are at least 15 years old that are not covered by a local rent ordinance are also potentially covered by rent control. But it's different because why would it be simple, right? So if you live in, let's say, a new building, right? I would call a building that's 15 years to 20 years old a relatively new building. A lot of those are probably in the dog patch or somewhere downtown or in Soma, for example. You wouldn't normally have rent control, but state law may apply as long as it's still an apartment building. The same exemptions that apply for rent control in San Francisco that we talked about before, condos, single family homes, for example, are not governed by state rent control either. And there are exemptions for 2-unit buildings if a landlord's been continuously residing in one of them. There's lots of different exemptions. So what do I say? Rather than trying to memorize this, if you're not sure, you live in a building that's 15 years old or 20 years old, or at least was built after 1979, and you're like, do I have any protections or not? Talk to a tenant lawyer, go to the tenants union, and you can find out more information, okay? There are some specific differences also under state law rent control, namely that it's way less strict than the San Francisco rent control laws are. So again, we talked about, last year the rent increase, allowable rent increase at this, according to that slide, was something like 2%. Whereas under the California rent ordinance, if you only had protections under that, they can raise it up to 10%. So it's not crazy, like 10% is not like an amazing protection for tenants. But if let's say you live in a small town and all of a sudden there's a boom, an economic boom, and rents go crazy, well, you have some protections maybe. Okay. All right. Now we're looking at the just causes for eviction. So earlier I said that the San Francisco rent ordinance, which we're going back to that, the San Francisco rent ordinance has 16 just causes for eviction. A just cause means that it is legit. You can bring an eviction action, attempt to evict a tenant for one of these 16 reasons. These include things that are where I would call them a fault eviction, right? Like you didn't pay your rent on time, or you chronically are not paying rent on time. Breaching a term that's a material term of your lease. Example of that is, I don't know, you are operating an illegal gambling operation out of your apartment or something. I mean, it's something that is in violation of the lease or in violation of the law. A nuisance is another type of eviction allegation that is covered under the rent ordinance as a just cause. Nuisance evictions can be hard for landlords to prove, but they can include things like if there's an allegation from other tenants that you're playing loud music at all hours of the night, and they give you notice, hey, you need to stop playing loud music or you're going to get evicted, right? That's causing disruption for other tenants. And then we have things that are more along the lines of, you didn't do anything wrong, but you could still get evicted. And those are called no fault evictions. And examples of that, there's really two, are owner move-in evictions and Ellis evictions. And you've probably heard of both of them, but we're going to go over them as well because they are important as sort of things to be aware of if you're a tenant. You should also be aware, just when we're going back to sort of the types of evictions, that some evictions are known colloquially as a gotcha eviction. So gotcha evictions are, maybe a landlord. We don't see them as much when the market is like it is right now, right? Where San Francisco is not quite the desirable place for the 22-year-old tech guy who just graduated from college and wants to go move here and get their first job and is beating down landlords' doors, right? We're not having the same kind of influx of people moving here as we did 10, 15 years ago. Still obviously an amazing city, beautiful place to live, but the dynamics have shifted. And so in the past, like when I started in this field, it was so crazy, like just how many, just how hot the market was, that landlords were finding any reason they could to kick out long-term tenants. Because if you were a tenant who had been in your home for any amount of time, your rent is much lower than market rate. And the way that rent increases work in San Francisco, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, is that once the last original tenant moves out of a unit that's covered under the rent ordinance, that's when the landlord can raise the rent to market. So to go back to my earlier example, if I move in tomorrow and I'm paying $3,000, right? I'm just making this number up. I don't, and in 10 years, we're in another major tech boom where market rent is $6,000 and I'm still paying maybe, $3,500, $4,000 total with those rent increases. I'm paying way below market rent. And a landlord may be more incentivized to kick me out or find a gotcha reason to kick me out so that they can charge the next person $6,000. Does that make sense? Cool. That's what we had in spades in the early 2010s. And landlords would find any pretextual reason to kick a tenant out just to put pressure on tenants. Okay, so examples were like breaching a lease. Oh, you replaced that wall sconce that was falling out and you made it nicer. How dare you? That's a horrible violation, and we are now going to try and evict you for it. Having roommates that were unapproved by a landlord, or having a pet, that was not approved by a landlord, are examples of gotcha evictions. Like we already kind of talked about nuisance, so I don't think there's anything more we need to go over with that. Basically, just the definition of a nuisance is it's a substantial interference with comfort, safety, or enjoyment of the landlord or tenants in the building. So I've had a number of cases where a tenant moves in to quiet, like a little bookstore downstairs or something like that. And after they move in, it becomes a bar or a restaurant. And they have deliveries coming at 3 in the morning or something like that. And it's highly disruptive, for example. That can be a lawsuit. That can be a nuisance lawsuit. Okay. But that's not for an eviction. That would be a tenant, dealing with a nuisance and trying to sue a landlord, for example. Okay, next slide. Jane Kim, famously, she's a former supervisor, awesome politician, local San Francisco politician, former board of supervisor member, pushed for legislation in 2015 to try to get rid of some of these gotcha evictions. It was called Evictions 2.0. That is kind of how it was referred to, if that rings a bell, if you were living here then. And basically the goal was to try and cut down some of these gotcha evictions. So gives tenants a chance to cure minor offenses. For nuisance evictions, it requires a higher level of proof. can't have an eviction for adding a roommate. It made it much easier for tenants to add roommates. It used to be a lot more difficult, and now it's been 10 years, which is great. And for the most part, if you're a tenant, you want to have a roommate, you're gonna be able to have a roommate. It also let's see, regulates initial rent after no fault evictions. Regulates initial rent. Not oh yeah, okay. I think yeah, that's a little confusing, but I think what that's referring to is it basically said that if, for example, you re-rent a property after an Ellis eviction or an owner move-in eviction within a certain time frame, a landlord is prevented from charging market rent. So in other words, it was designed to discourage tenant landlords at least a little bit from doing a no-fault eviction, because it could still just have an impact on what rents could be thereafter, at least for the short term. Owner move-in evictions. This comes up for me in my practice at least a couple times a week. Why? Well, owner move-in evictions, it's not that they're happening all the time and they're this thing you need to worry is around the corner for you, okay? But it's something to be aware of as a possible outcome in certain circumstances. What is an owner move-in eviction? It is a just cause for eviction where a landlord says, hey, I want to move back into my property. I see it the most commonly when there's been a sale of a property, specifically something like a single family home or a smaller building, 2, 3 units, 4 units tops, where somebody is like, you know what, I'm buying this property and now I'd like to live there. Occasionally we see it where there's been a transfer of ownership, like the property is owned, it's been in the family for a generation, a couple generations, and the younger generation takes ownership and they want to move in. Sometimes it's a landlord who's, whatever reason, they're like, you know what, I want to come back to this place. Okay. And they can do it, but there are strong restrictions on when and how they can do it. It's a 60-day eviction notice. They are required to pay relocation money. It's not a lot of money, unfortunately, but they are required to pay some relocation funds. And if you are a senior, that is, you're over 60 and you've lived in your home for at least 10 years, or if you are a tenant of 5 years and are catastrophically ill, you have a complete defense to an owner move-in and can prevent it from happening, with some exceptions. Exceptions, unfortunately, are if the landlord is also over 60, for example, the one who wants to move in, then that's not a trump card. But you can be a protected tenant, and that can have some effect of pushing back on an owner move-in eviction and possibly preventing it. You can only do one owner move-in eviction per building, but landlords who already live there or are doing an owner move-in eviction can also trigger what's called a relative move-in eviction and take over multiple units in the property. That is a thing that happens occasionally. A landlord can't do an owner move-in eviction during the school year, where there's a family with school workers or with children of any age. It's not any age, they have to be school age children, I believe. So I don't think they can be like 35, right? Hey, I have a kid, but my kid is, not in school and 40 years old. Wouldn't work. Okay. Yeah, owners are creative. I mean, this is basically like trying to figure out different ways for them to get back possession because of eviction controls. A lot of times what we see are that landlords, before they go the route of a buyout or an owner move-in, they will try to negotiate before a landlord goes through the route of an owner move-in or an Ellis eviction, they will attempt to negotiate a buyout of a tenant's tenancy. We aren't really going into that too much today, but you should know that buyouts are disfavored strongly by the tenants union. So keep that in mind. If you are approached about one, talk to a lawyer, evaluate your options. You want to have a lawyer help you if you go down that road, but we're not going to deal with that today for the most part. Okay, let's keep going. All right, next we have Ellis evictions. So I mentioned there's 2 types of no-fault evictions, Ellis and owner move-in. Ellis is the other. Ellis eviction is basically if a landlord decides they want to go out of the landlord business, right? They maybe owned a property for many years. and they want to sell them off individually for owners to live in themselves, for example. They just don't want to be a landlord anymore. This is an option for them sometimes. However, it's pretty onerous. There's a lot of restrictions and rules for owner move-in and for Ellis evictions that landlords have to follow that make it a real question whether it makes sense for them to do it or not. Ellis evictions are usually a last best option for landlords. It's a 120-day notice period for an owner, or excuse me, for an Ellis eviction notice. If a tenant is senior or disabled, the tenant can petition, say, hey, actually, I'm senior, or actually, I'm disabled, and get up to a year to vacate. They are likewise entitled to relocation payments, although I think it's about $10,000 in change per tenant right now. So it's not a ton of money, and there's a cap per unit of about 30,000. Tenants who are senior or disabled can also get additional funds, which we're going to get to, I think, on the next slide. Oh, yeah. I mean, okay. So getting help might be a bluff or legal. Well, if you get an actual Ellis eviction notice, you have a decision to make, just like you would if you get any other eviction notice. You're going to stay or you're going to fight it. With the Ellis Act, once an actual eviction notice has been served, that doesn't mean there's a lawsuit. It's a notice giving you 120 days to move out. Probably worth going to the Tenderloin Housing Clinic or another nonprofit or speaking with a lawyer and having them review that notice to see if it's up to snuff. Sometimes there are issues with these notices. I wouldn't call it a bluff once you get a notice, but if a landlord is threatening to do an owner move-in eviction or Ellis as part of buyout discussions, for example, it may be a total bluff or it may be legit. Yeah, you do have only 30 days to notify a landlord that you are elderly or disabled or otherwise entitled to relocation money, additional relocation money. So it is really important that you let them know if and when that happens. And lastly, there's power in numbers. Organizing can be really powerful. If your building is getting Ellis evicted, talk to your neighbors. Don't take it sitting down. Talk to the tenants union. Organize a rent strike. There's different things you can do. I wouldn't just do them arbitrarily. I would talk to professionals, figure out what your options are, form your own tenants union, etc. But there is power in working together. Okay, this is the current rubric for relocation money. I mentioned it briefly earlier. Owner move-ins, just over $8,000 per occupant with a 24,000 and change max per unit. However, for an additional under an owner move-in, each senior tenant or disabled tenant or household with a minor child can get an additional $5,375. For an Ellis eviction, it's a little bit more money per occupant, still has a max to it. And again, a little bit more per occupant for tenants who are protected or disabled. One thing to keep in mind is that often these numbers will serve as a floor. If a landlord's threatening a buyout, they're going to look to these numbers and say, hey, if you get an owner move in, you're only going to get this amount. Or if you get Ellis evicted, you're only going to get this amount. So this is something that does come up a fair bit in those discussions. So how can you protect yourself from eviction? I mean, you should be familiar with the terms of your lease. You should definitely make sure that if you are making changes to your lease, that you get it in writing. So examples of that are your lease says you can't have dogs. You want to get a dog. Well, probably not great to get one if your lease says no dogs. But if you ask your landlord and they say, yeah, that's fine, no worries, follow it up in writing to memorialize that your understanding is that you can have a dog. Thanks, Jane. It's great talking to you today. As we discussed, you mentioned I could have a dog as long as they were under 40 pounds and housebroken. I am getting a dog that follows, those guidelines and appreciate your consideration. That way, later, if there's ever a dispute, it's not ambiguous as to whether they actually gave you that approval or not. You have it in writing, or at least you have it in writing that you said it and they didn't refute it. And the burden then shifts to them to refute that claim. Ownership changes are a place where you can see a shift in how your tenancy is handled, right? Because you have a different person or people involved. So I don't want you to be afraid of your building being sold or if it gets sold. But the reality is that when there's a new owner or ownership group, they're probably paying a premium to purchase a property in San Francisco. And if they are paying for a property that is occupied by tenants, they are not going to be able to recoup their their investment as quickly if the tenants are long-term low rent paying tenants. That's not the tenant's fault, obviously, but it can mean that landlords are incentivized to try and work out a way to get those tenants to vacate. And that could be through a buyout or through a no-fault eviction. Likewise, if you're an owner and you're selling a property, there's incentive for them to sell it vacant, depending on the property. Again, I don't want to create a monster here and have everybody worrying about their property getting sold and it impacting them, because it really depends on the type of building you live in. If you live in a 20 unit building, you're not getting owner move and evicted, you're not getting Ellis evicted, and you're probably not getting bought out. Maybe you will, but it's less likely. And the reason why is because an owner who has the money to buy a 20 unit building for 5 million, $20 million, whatever the heck it is, isn't going to turn around and be like, you know what I want to do? I want to live in a 20 unit apartment building, right? That's not where they're going with it. And they would probably have no other, there's not really a lot of uses for that building other than as a rental property. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But if you live in a 2 unit building, yes, it's higher. There's a chance that it's going to incentivize your landlord is going to have some motivation to at least explore seeing if they can work out a deal to encourage you to vacate legally. Whatever you do, don't just leave. If the landlord asks you to move out, don't just move out. Know your rights, learn your rights, get help. One cool thing in San Francisco is that there is a right to counsel that was based on a law that was passed, a measure that was passed in 2018. And basically, it gives tenants the ability to get a free lawyer when defending an eviction lawsuit. So that doesn't mean when you get an eviction notice, but let's say you got a 60-day owner move in, for example, that's the notice period for that, and you don't move out during the 60 days. Well, then the landlord has to file an eviction lawsuit and go through a whole lawsuit process to actually recover possession and evict you. And a tenant can go to the Eviction Defense Collaborative, among other nonprofits, in order to get help and potential representation in defending that lawsuit. There are some specific exemptions for that. It doesn't apply to evictions among roommates, or like if the owner of the building or unit lives in that unit with you, then you're not a tenant. You're what's called a lodger, most likely, anyways, and it wouldn't be covered under the right to counsel. If you are served with an eviction lawsuit, there's a really short time period, and so it's really important that you act quickly to avoid displacement. This is honestly super, super important. Okay, we're talking about repairs. The vast majority of the tenants that I help on a daily basis, that my firm helps on a daily basis, are calling us because they're living in bad living conditions. And unfortunately, it's inevitable when you have tenants who, when you have landlords who are, not motivated to give tenants a clean, healthy place to live. Some landlords are better than others when it comes to repairs. If you have an issue with your apartment, even if you're afraid that your landlord is, oh, I have cheap rent, I don't want to rock the boat, oh, my landlord's going to get mad at me, whatever it is, you have a right to a safe, healthy apartment. It's really important that you make repair requests in writing. You arguably also have a duty to notify the landlord if there's a repair issue. If you have a leak, you can't just let it leak indefinitely and possibly damage the property. That could get you in trouble. That could give the landlord an argument to potentially try and evict you. Really important to notify your landlord in writing. I don't love text messages because if you lose your phone, you lose the evidence. Why are you putting it in writing? One, to let the landlord know of the problem, so they're on notice, they can't dispute that. And two, so that if you ever have a dispute later as to whether the landlord knew about it, you have evidence, and that's going to be really critical if there's ever a lawsuit or a petition before the rent board, etc. Okay. This slideshow recommends putting a letter in the mail. I think email is fine if that's how you communicate with your landlord. Just keep track of it. If you do send a letter, sign it, date it, keep a copy, start a folder where you keep all your records. There are so many times where I'm talking to tenants who didn't complain in writing or they didn't keep copies, and it does make it harder to get justice. If the problem persists or is really severe, contact the Department of Building Inspection. There is a way to submit a complaint online. You can also call the Housing Inspection Services number here, and they will send an inspector out to investigate. If they see housing code violations, they will issue what's called a notice of violation. Very helpful for us lawyers if we want to be able to show that there was wrongdoing by a landlord. Again, it also provides landlords with actual notice of the problem that they can't really refute because it's a notice from the city. It's going to be hard for them to deny that existence. And if a landlord doesn't make repairs within a certain time period, I believe it's 30 days, then they face potential fines and penalties as well. Same thing goes with like pest issues, mold issues, for example. You can contact the Department of Public Health and file a complaint, and they'll send somebody out as well. Mold is tricky. So if you're dealing with a mold issue, talk to a tenant counselor first or a lawyer. Retaliation is prohibited. This is pretty straightforward. You can't retaliate against a tenant for making complaints. And it's a defense to certain allegations for eviction as well. Your landlord can also not terminate your tenancy without a just cause, raise your rent without a just cause, or excuse me, they can't raise your rent without it being in accordance with the allowable rent increases. And they can't change the terms of your tenancy just because you complained about housing conditions. Let's keep on. This has to do with the right to organize. So, there are rules now. Landlords cannot prevent tenants from organizing. By organizing, that's like creating a tenants union, gathering together, etc. They can't prevent you from doing that. And so, for example, failure to allow organizing activities in a common area of the building, that is actually inappropriate. And so it's something you may be able to use to support a petition for a rent reduction at the rent board if they're refusing to allow you to do that. The idea behind this is basically like tenants should be able to speak their minds, to gather, and not be afraid of retribution. How can you fight back? Three main things. We've kind of covered them all already. One is you got to learn your rights. I really recommend joining the San Francisco Tenants Union as a quick plug. We have an incredible handbook that you can buy and become as a member. I'm not trying to like make this an infomercial, but this thing is like the tenant Bible. Can't really see it, but very useful. Step two on fighting back is assert your rights. Complain in writing to your landlord. Contact the city where appropriate. Take your landlord to the rent board. If you are, you had a garage, now you don't. The landlord said he's taking your garage away, and that's part of your rent. Go to the rent board and demand a decrease in rent or to have that service restored. And finally, get involved. There's incredible organizations in this city and around the Bay Area that are designed and targeted at helping tenants fight bad landlord behavior. And I'm really proud to be a part of that. There's lots of wonderful organizations other than the Tenants Union. Obviously, Home SF is fantastic. Get involved, know your rights, assert your rights. And again, you can join the San Francisco Tenants Union. You can organize your building, your neighborhood. Keep an eye out for legislation that is tenant oriented. Over the last couple of years, there have been petitions on the ballot to try and overturn Costa-Hawkins. Unfortunately, those have failed so far. They're statewide, ballot initiatives, but there's always something on the ballot that impacts your rights as a tenant or can expand them, and make sure you keep an eye on those.
So,
Uh,
Daniel, that was a great piece. I definitely would love to have some our viewers or our workshoppers basically be able to ask you the questions that they have. But we get there, I just want to give some information to everybody who's on here. So as he's mentioned, Home San Francisco can also be a resource if you do want to be able to be connected with resources or referrals to agencies like the San Francisco Tenants Union and other like agencies. You can either go to our website at Home San Francisco. We've changed our name, by the way, homesanfrancisco.org, or you could call us at 415-202-5464, or email us at info@homesanfrancisco.org. We have people on those lines basically being able to get the information and refer you to the proper channels and proper resources. Also, another thing is that if you've gotten information regarding this workshop through our Summer of Housing calendar, we want to invite you again to our affordable housing resource fair and help center. You should have seen this also on the Summer of Housing events calendar. So this is part of the 2 month affordable housing events that are being held all over the city. This particular in-person event is going to happen at the University of San Francisco, USF, and it's going to be at the McLaren Hall. We also have a separate help center that's occurring at the same campus at the University Center. So we have access to resources as well as access to counselors who can be available to provide you assistance and information you need regarding your housing concerns. That being said, I do want to leave some room still for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to either put it on the chat or maybe unmute yourselves so you could ask your questions.
Yeah, I have a question. I know we are at the end of this amazing presentation, but is there any rights for those people who verbally rent to the principal tenant the living room separated with a curtain and leaving 4 people, parents and 2 children, in that corner of the living room? So is there any law, anything that protects them? I work
so
for Crescent and we help families to access resources in San Francisco. And I always struggle how to advocate for them because they don't know they have to have everything in writing until I say so. So,
yeah,
yeah.
so I want to make sure I understand the question. Thank you for your question and for the work that you do. So you're saying do tenants who are like living in a living room have rights basically? Is that
Yeah, but they don't rent to the owner, they rent to the principal tenant who
well, yeah, they
uh
have rights.
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like, if they live, they're called what's called a subtenant. So if you live in a unit, let's just say, I'll just give you an example. I'll use myself again. So if I rent an apartment from a landlord, right? And then I rent out, it's a 3 bedroom apartment, and I rent out the other 2 bedrooms and the living room. I use it as another bedroom, right? Those
Yep.
people still have rights. I'm now stepping into the shoes of the landlord as the master tenant. I'm now effectively their landlord. And so I still owe them duties and responsibilities.
Yeah.
Um, it can be tricky. Disputes between subtenants and master tenants can be quite difficult. And the reason why is because there's less accountability. The master tenant doesn't own the property, they don't have insurance. They're more likely to do something that is not legal than a landlord is because they don't know what they're doing. So it can get a lot more complicated. But absolutely, those people in that living room have some rights for sure.
Okay. I will send you an email when I have again.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you so
But
much.
yeah, of course. Other questions? Sarah says, my son and his wife have mold in their apartment. You've had testing confirmed. They're allergic and the landlord just ignores the request. What recourse? This is a great question. We see this a lot. I would first recommend that they have, if they got the apartment tested, go talk to a lawyer, whether it's, someone of the tenants union or a private lawyer, and have them take a look at the test results. One thing to be aware of is like the presence of mold, it's not all created equal. So there's different types of mold and there's different levels of elevation. So obviously the question is always how severe is the mold and what kind of mold? And is it visible? Is it visible and it's just on the corners of a window, or is it like wide swaths? What is the concentration when you do a test, etc. And so those things are important. And then, again, your landlord has an obligation to remedy those issues if they're severe. The question is, of course, whether it is a serious problem or not. If it's low levels of mold, well, unfortunately, we live in a marine environment, and so it's often going to be the case that we get a little bit of mold, but that doesn't mean that a lot of mold is okay. It's not. Mold can be quite dangerous. It can be quite unhealthy, and landlords do have an obligation to fix it. If it's severe mold and a landlord still won't fix it, talk to a lawyer. And the options might be getting the public Department of Public Health involved. They can be a little bit unuseful when it comes to mold. I want to be careful of what I say because we're recording this, but the reality is that they take a pretty conservative approach in my experience when it comes to flagging mold as a notice of violation issue. If they don't see a really large swath of mold, they may not cite it, and that can actually empower a landlord to continue to be neglectful. So you got to be careful about that. But if mold is really bad and the landlord neglects it, often and the tenant is complaining in writing, that can lead to what we call a constructive eviction, where a tenant ultimately moves out and sues a landlord because the conditions are so bad. But there's a right way to do that, and you want to make sure that there's good evidence of complaints, the problems are severe, and that the options have been exhausted. And that means talking to a lawyer.
Okay, so additionally, my daughter-in-law, since they've been living there, has acquired this horrible autoimmune disorder that's really upset her life, her work,
Yeah.
and her energy. And my grandson, who is 6, just had to have his adenoids removed. And they were both tested and found to be allergic to the mold that's present in their house.
Yeah,
So,
this, I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but those are big red flags, right?
yeah,
So, definitely want to talk to a lawyer. It can be tricky, to always be able to prove causation. That is
yeah.
the causal connection between the mold exposure and the medical harm. And a lot of
Mhm.
doctors are pretty conservative about, establishing that. But
Right.
it can be done. And, again, if they haven't already done it, generally recommend that tenants in that situation also get some blood work done. You can do what's called like a myotoxin test to determine if there are myotoxins, which are a type of toxic component that is found in mold in the
Mhm.
bloodstream.
Okay,
But
thank you.
talk to a lawyer, like for sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Sylvia, for sharing your information. And thank you so much for providing us an insight of your situations. Thank you. It's about 7:32, and our meeting is supposed to end at 7:30. However, Daniel, I don't know if you'd like to stay a little bit more if some other people have questions.
Happy to answer a few more questions if anybody else has questions.
Yeah, I know for those who need to actually exit out from the workshop, thank you so much for joining us. But thank you so much, Daniel, also for staying over for a few more questions.
My pleasure. Anything else?
Thank you. I have to leave.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you so
Sarah.
much.
My
Thanks.
I'm so
pleasure.
sorry about the situation, Sarah, that you've shared. Hoping the
Oh,
best for
yeah.
your family.
It's troubling.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Hopefully they will, if they move out, they'll hopefully feel better. That is a thing we often see.
Right.
But yeah, I would say it's time to talk to a lawyer for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Okay. Good night.
Good
All
night,
right. If there's
Sylvia.
nothing else, thanks everybody.
Anybody else? Okay, it looks like we're good. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those basically who are still on the channel, I invite you to also fill in a survey. We would love to continue to provide these types of workshops to you and make sure that we provide workshops that are relevant and reaching and basically being able to address you and your needs. So feel free to click the screen, just like take a screenshot of the QR code and it takes you directly to the survey. Thank you so much and have a great day. And thank you, Daniel. I've been such a great resource for us and I do appreciate the information you've shared. It's really good to see it from a very logical and very practical point of view. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you again for having me and thanks for coming, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. You take care. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.